30 years ago, a game came out that would forever influence not just role-playing games, but video games as a whole. That game was The Elder Scrolls Arena, the very first Elder Scrolls game. Across those 30 years and several more releases, with its incredibly intricate lore and open-end gameplay, The Elder Scrolls has captured the imagination of millions and has cemented itself as one of the greatest video game franchises ever. But 30 years is a long time, and by today's standards, Arena is a pretty, well, antiquated game. This series has changed a lot since then in several ways, but Arena is still a really interesting game to explore for any Elder Scrolls fan. On the official 30th anniversary of the game and the series as a whole, I'd like to honor it by sharing a bunch of fun and obscure facts about Arena that you may not have known. So sit down, open up DOSBox, and let's go to a time when the Elder Scrolls was much more simple. The first thing I'll be going over is that the 30th anniversary probably actually passed already. Arena was originally planned to be released in Christmas in 1993, but the development team missed their deadline, and the official release had to be delayed a few months, which, according to Bethesda, is March 25th, 1994. However, that doesn't appear to be the case if we take a look at a few old Usenet newsboard posts, which was basically a super early version of modern-day forums and social media. The game potentially shipped as early as February 3rd, and a few people had been playing it as early as February 27th, with the patch also being out by then. But for some reason, Bethesda uses March 25th as the anniversary date. Regardless, the delayed release date of the game was actually really bad for Bethesda back then. Bethesda was pretty small in the early 90s, meaning that pretty much every title had to be a financial success in order to not go bankrupt. According to Julian LaFay, the game's lead programmer, the situation was so tight that Arena was made in less than 12 months, which is actually crazy. In addition to the delayed release, distributors had discovered that Bethesda hadn't made the game they promised. More on that in just a second. And so only a few thousand copies of the game were sent out. The employees were certain that they had screwed up and that the company would go out of business, but the game slowly gained attention through word of mouth, and in a few months it became a cult hit. Let's get back to what I was saying about Bethesda not making the game they said they would. This is something that most people probably do already know, but it's still worth mentioning when talking about the game. Arena was never actually supposed to be an RPG at first. It was meant to be a Gladiator-style fighting game. You would have your own character that would be a part of a team, and that team would go around to the various cities of Tamriel in order to compete in various tournaments until you work your way up to the final tournament in the Imperial City, where you fight Yeagar Tharn. In fact, you can still find some images of an early UI that shows 4 characters at the bottom of the screen. However, the developers were massive fans of pen and paper role-playing games like D&D and the popular CRPGs of the time, like Ultima Underworld and the much lesser known Legends of Valor, and that ended up rubbing off heavily on the game during development. Side quests that had a role-playing focus were slowly added on. This got more and more in-depth until the entire Gladiator idea was scrapped and the game became a full-on RPG, with the party system also being scrapped entirely in order to put more emphasis on the player and role-playing. There is actually a small remnant from the time of when the game was supposed to be a Gladiator fighting game. A text file was uncovered from the game that contains the names of all the Gladiator teams from all the major cities. For example, the team from Winterhold in Skyrim was supposed to be called the Annihilators. The team from Sentinel and Hammerfell was supposed to be called the Deathbringers. The team from Alinor in the Somerset Isles was supposed to be called the Protectors, and so on. Pretty much all of these names were completely discarded, but some of them were actually reused down the line. The team from Dune and Elsewhere was supposed to be called the Blades, which was later used for the elite Imperial unit that served the Emperor. The Elder Scrolls Online also pays respect to this. The team from Elinhir in Hammerfell was supposed to be called the Blackcasters, which was later reused for the group of mages that reside within the city, called the Blackcaster Mages Guild. The city of Sunhold in the Somerset Isles is prominent for its deep connection with griffins. Can you guess what the team was supposed to be called in Arena? That's right, the Griffins. Anyways, at that point, advertising for the game was already done, and the cover art for the boxes was already made, which is why it doesn't look very, well, fitting. The game was simply called Arena back then, and someone on the development team came up with the idea that Tamriel was called the Arena because it was such a violent and unforgiving world. The surtitle, The Elder Scrolls, was tacked on by developer Vijay Lakshman in order to make the game more RPG sounding and give it a novel-like feel. implying that Arena would be only one chapter in the grand story of the Elder Scrolls. Speaking of Vijay Lakshman, he actually deserves a lot of recognition for how much he contributed to Tamriel's early world building. He was the lead designer, writer, and executive producer for the game, and he came up with a bunch of the original maps and lore for Tamriel. He also originally had plans for Arena to have several in-game expansions in the style of campaign modules from D&D. If you want more info on that, and how the Elder Scrolls as a whole was influenced by D&D, I have another video dedicated to that topic. One more fun fact about Vijay is that Yeagar Tharn is actually modeled after him. Rhea Silmain was also portrayed by another one of the developers, Jennifer Pratt. Nobody actually knows who did the voices for the characters in the game though, including Uriel Septim, as they went uncredited. Anyways, did you know that lots of the names of Tamriel's provinces and cities are actually pretty much ripped straight out of other fantasy novels and settings? For example, Valenwood is named after the Valenwood trees of Dragonlance, which are hundreds of feet tall and have settlements built on them, and could be found in the elven kingdom of Qualinesti, which sounds a lot like the Valenwood city of Fallenesti. Hammerfell is taken from the book The Heirs of Hammerfell, which is part of the Dark Over series by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Morrowind is taken from the Shannara series by Terry Brooks, where there was an island named Morrowindle, which was populated by elves, and was filled with swamps and desert, and had a massive volcano in the center. Yeah. Alinor from the Somerset Isles is taken from Valinor, the land of the Valar and elves in J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth. Lots of randomly generated NPC names also reference the Lord of the Rings. Aragorn and Legolas are possible names for Bosmer, Gandalf, Sauron, and Saruman are possible names for High Elves, and a possible name you might encounter when talking to people in the Imperial City is Morgoth. While we're on the topic of names, weirdly enough, the Argonians in Arena had this kind of Roman naming scheme where you could get names like Caesar, Caligula, Diocletian, and others. In later games, the Roman naming scheme would be used for Imperials, and Argonians would have their own distinct names. Another weird thing about the Argonians in Arena is that they look really different from how they look in later games. They're blue, more human-like, and can apparently have hair. The same thing can be said for the Khajiit, who just look like humans with tattoos. Khajiit weren't envisioned as actual cat people in Arena, rather they were descended from an intelligent feline race and have some traits left over. This was obviously changed in later games. In order to explain this, the concept of first stocks and different kinds of Khajiit being born under different phases of the moon was introduced. The types of Khajiit we see in Arena are of the Ohm's first stock, which look very similar to humans. It's less clear for Argonians as to why they looked so distinct in Arena, with a bunch of different theories, but it's most commonly believed that they are part of a distinct tribe, with their morphology being affected by a unique history and its sap. But getting back to locations, lots of Arena's dungeons make appearances in later Elder Scrolls games. Fang Lair, Cillian's Web, Labyrinthian, the Crystal Tower, the Crypt of Hearts, the Halls of Colossus, and Red Mountain all reappear in ESO. Labyrinthian also has an appearance in Skyrim, the Crypt of Hearts is seen in Shadowkey, and, of course, Red Mountain reappears in Morrowind. Also, if you didn't know, in Arena, Red Mountain was called Dagoth-Ur, which should remind you of something, or, well, someone. A pretty interesting thing to note about Arena's map is that there are several locations and towns that have names that are different from how they appear in later games. For example, Alderun from Morrowind used to be called Oldrun, and Silvar Wood from ESO used to be called Silverwood. In order to explain this, Lawrence Schick, who was the former lead writer and lore master for ESO, claimed that the Third Empire imperialized the titles as they were making maps of their new territories. Another thing about Arena's map is that Cyrodiil didn't exist yet. At least it wasn't known by that name. Cyrodiil was simply called the Imperial Province, and there was no such thing as Imperials back then. It wasn't really a weird fantasy version of Rome like it is now. It was pretty much just envisioned as a place where all the different cultures of Tamriel blended together. But weirdly enough, in the game, all the NPCs there use the Redguard sprite, yet don't have the names that Redguards in Hammerfell would have. You may have noticed that another race is seemingly missing. Orcs were not a playable race back then. They were just another enemy that could be encountered. In the game, there's only one location you can go to in the Imperial Province, the Imperial City, where the game's final dungeon is located. It appears that there were supposed to be other dungeons around the province, but it ended up being cut content. That's not all that was cut from Arena. The game was mentioned in the October 1993 edition of the French gaming magazine Gen 4, with a screenshot of a monster that looks a lot like a Beholder, one of the most iconic Dungeons & Dragons monsters, which was probably cut because of copyright issues. A few other screenshots of the game in its beta stages show some interesting things, like an unused auto-mapping feature, a demon-like monster, an alternate version of the Lich enemy, whatever this creepy skull is, a slave market, and what appears to be a prostitute. Nice. Getting into the game itself, Arena actually has a somewhat in-depth system for alcohol tolerance, believe it or not. After a long day of adventuring through Tamriel, you can talk with a bartender and order a drink. The more drinks you order, the more likely you are to get drunk. How much you can drink is tied to your endurance stat. When you get drunk, your strength, willpower, luck, and endurance stats are increased, but your intelligence, personality, speed, and agility are all decreased. For whatever reason, the game treats alcohol as magic, and because the Britons have an innate resistance to magic, they have a much higher tolerance for alcohol. There are different stages of drunkenness, and your stats are increased or decreased depending on which stage you're at. If you eventually get to the point where one of your stats hit 0, you end up dying. No worse way to go than drinking yourself to death than having a Gartharn mock you for it. But Arena's systems don't stop there. The game has many mechanics that you might never really notice without paying attention. For example, the weather. In Arena, different regions are assigned different weather conditions that the player might come across depending on the season. During winter time, you'll often encounter foggy or snowy conditions in Skyrim, but see rain and sunshine when you go over to Southern Hammerfell. Weather doesn't have a massive impact on the game, save for fog limiting your vision or travel times being increased during difficult weather, but it provides some nice flavor. Equipment stores, mages guilds, inns, palaces, and temples all have unique welcoming text depending on the season and what the weather is like outside. You can also actually go beyond the bounds of city walls and explore the wilderness of Tamriel. You can come across things like small farms, villages, and even crypts with loot. All of it is procedurally generated with a tile-based system though, and there isn't much in the way of interesting or unique terrain, but it is kind of cool. But be careful, if you go too far and save and reload your game, or enter and exit a building, your game can end up looking like, well, this. I think this is what Chim feels like. Included with copies of the game was the game manual, the Arena Player's Guide, and the first thing that could be found within was an introductory story, which is actually a pretty fascinating read. It basically describes the very first scene in the game, where the player awakens in a jail cell in the Imperial dungeons from the view of a man named Talon. Talon wonders what he's doing here, until Rhea Silmain appears before him, and informs him of how Gartharn has impersonated the Emperor and banished him to another dimension. Rhea leaves Talon with the ruby key he needed to exit his cell, and then Talon sets off on his quest. So this is pretty interesting because it literally gives a canonical gender and name to the player character and eternal champion, being Talon. Also, remember that screenshot with the auto-mapping feature I mentioned earlier? Well, the full image shows a Breton character named Talon. A bunch of other screenshots do show other characters with different names and races, but it's a pretty interesting thing to note. This makes things kind of weird though, because there is already another character who goes by that name, being Talon Warhaft, leader of the Imperial Guard. Why the same names were used is anybody's guess, but regardless, the game does a lot to establish a backstory for the Eternal Champion and a relationship with Talon Warhaft. For example, one of the character creation questions explicitly states that the name of the player's character's father was Talon. Another one claims that he fought in a place known as Borum Valley, where his men had routed the enemy. It states, his men, which implies that he was some kind of commander, which really suggests that Talon Warhaft was the player character's father. This is backed up by an intro slide that was cut from the game, which explicitly states that Talon Warhaft was the player's guardian, and that at 17 years old, the Eternal Champion was sent out to travel across Tamriel. Other character creation questions give even more backstory on the Eternal Champion, talking about several scenarios from their childhood. They lived in an unspecified village with several relatives, and often trained in weaponry in a class taught by an arms master Festal. Just really quickly while we're talking about the character quiz, a fun fact about it is that one of the scenarios presented is that you're enjoying a sweet roll, and then a group of 3 other kids come and try to take it from you. This is the origin of the sweet roll running gag that's present throughout several Bethesda games. But getting back on topic, the introductory story in the manual also mentions that the Eternal Champion was actually summoned to the Imperial Court in order to learn magic from Rhea Silmain, where he served as a minor member. This is slightly unrelated to Arena, but we also have an official date of birth for the Eternal Champion. The Daggerfall game guide, the Daggerfall Chronicles, claims that the Eternal Champion was born in 3E370. With Arena taking place in 3E389, this means that the Eternal Champion was only 19 years old when they started their quest. One quick thing that I'd like to mention is that the intro story also mentions the Amulet of Kings. The idea for an arena appeared to be it having some kind of enchantment that would warn the Elder Council if something happened to the Emperor rather than the whole Dragonfire thing, but it's still pretty cool to note. Anyways, that's not the only version of the manual that exists. Remember how I mentioned France earlier? They got a version of the manual too, except their intro story is completely different and, believe it or not, contains some really unique lore. It starts off with stuff that we already know, like how Septim is the Emperor, Tamriel sucks, living in is called the Arena, and all that. It claims that Yeagar Tharn grew jealous of the Emperor's power and wanted to take the throne for himself. Tharn knew he couldn't just kill the Emperor or any of his guards because the enchantment on the Amulet of Kings would warn the Elder Council, and regardless, his daughter, Ariella Septim, would rise to the throne. That's right. According to the French Arena manual, Uriel Septim VII had a daughter, who is never mentioned ever again for the rest of the series. It appears that for some reason she was retconned or completely forgotten about. The French version then goes on to give Warhaft a bit more backstory and his adventures with a man named Martin the Blade, and a unique version of the events of how Tharn banished both Septim and Warhaft to oblivion. So you may have been wondering why Warhaft is given a lot of attention when he has next to no importance in the actual game itself, to the degree where he was actually cut from the ending of the CD version of the game later on. This is because in an earlier version of the game, he actually did have a slightly more prominent role. The December 1993 edition of the gaming magazine Computer Gaming World contains an article that offered a sneak preview of Arena. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the game was originally supposed to have a party-based system? According to the article, the player character was the child of one of 4 Imperial Guards, being Talon Warhaft in your case, and the other members would be the children of the other Imperial Guards. But again, the party system was scrapped, the story was changed, and Warhaft was just kind of left over, probably due to the game's rush development. The player's guide has a few other interesting bits of lore. For example, it claims that Tamriel is approximately 12 million square kilometers, being, in its own words, roughly 3,000 to 4,000 kilometers east to west and 2,000 to 3,000 kilometers north to south. If this is true, then that means Tamriel is somewhere in between the size of Europe and Antarctica. Another bit of lore from the manuals, albeit one that's been retconned, is that eras originally lasted for 1,000 years. This is why the intro slide states that Uriel Septim became the Emperor 492 years after Tiber Septim did. Going by the 1,000 time year intervals, 492 years after 2E896 would give us 3E388, which is the year before the beginning of the Imperial Simulacrum. But contemporary lore states that the second era ended in 2E896, meaning that this is now just an incorrect number. But the most interesting bit is the section on guilds. Lots of famous organizations that appear in later Elder Scrolls games actually had their first appearance in Arena, in the form of some random encounters. The Mages Guild is the most obvious one, but it also mentions the Thieves Guild, the Dark Brotherhood, the Blades, and the Underking. Of course, they weren't nearly as well developed back then as they are now, but they clearly existed in the lore from the very beginning. The Dark Brotherhood were described to be followers of Sithis, the god of death. It appears that they weren't really envisioned as a secretive group of assassins back then, more so just being a group devoted to spreading death and chaos where they can. The Blades, the name being reused from the early Dune Gladiatorial team, also appear to be envisioned very differently back then, simply being a group of the greatest warriors on Tamriel, with no mention at all of any ties to the Emperor, and were known to be on both sides of the law. And even back then, the Underking had an aura of mystery surrounding him, with rumors saying that he was once an archmage that was somehow transformed, and now commands a legion of undead soldiers. The Necromancers, being enemies of both the Mages Guild and the Underking, and being, well, Necromancers, is clearly an early version of the cult led by Mana Marco, the King of Worms. And then there's another group known as the Warhaft, which hasn't been heard of at all since Arena. They're pretty much just another group of thieves that were the rivals of the Thieves Guild, but we can learn a bit more about them through the in-game quest for the artifact Finaster's Ring. The description for Finaster's Ring in Codex Scientia, the official Arena strategy guide, claims that Finaster was an adventurer who created the ring in order to help him during his adventures, granting him hundreds of years of life. The Warhaft killed Finaster and buried him in a place called the Forest of Elborn before stealing his ring and keeping it within one of their hideouts. What's especially interesting about this quest is that one of the rumors related to the Ring of Finaster is that Finaster was supposedly the same race as whatever the player is. Lore introduced later on in the series establishes that Finaster was a member of the Aldmeri pantheon of the Somerset Isles. Ted Peterson, who was also one of the lead designers of Arena, claimed in a later interview that the Finaster that wore the ring was named after the deity and is a completely separate individual. Something to note about the artifacts of Arena is that most of them don't have the seemingly divine origins that later games give them. For example, the Staff of Magnus. Magnus is nowadays known as one of the most prominent Et Ada, the original divine beings, but his Arena description refers to him as an Archmage. We can notice this in the descriptions for the Augma Infinium and the Warlock's Ring as well. They were the artifacts of Xerxes and Cyrodiil respectively, both of which are gods in the Aldmeri pantheon like Finaster, but in Arena, they were nothing more than powerful wizards. In the same interview that I just mentioned, Ted Peterson claims that most of these gods were simply written as legendary heroes, and that the deeper lore for them wasn't written yet. On the other hand, there is plenty of lore related to the artifacts that already was established during the time of Arena. Auriel's shield and bow come from, well, Auriel, who was described as a quasi-mythical elvish deity. The Ebony Mail description mentions Boethia. The concept of Daedric princes wasn't a thing back then, and Boethia was simply described as a dark elf goddess. Volendrung's description mentions that it was created by a clan of Dwemer known as the Rorken clan, who one day all mysteriously disappeared. Sound familiar? Aside from the Daedric artifacts, the Lord's Mail is described as the armor of Morahouse and the gift of Kinnereth. The Necromancer's Amulet is described as a relic of the mad sorcerer Manamarco, and the artifact King Orgrim's Coffer is described to have belonged to King Orgrim of Pyandania, the island nation of the Maormer, who lost it during a war against Antiochus Septim. For all that's been changed since the time of Arena, it's very obvious to see that it really is the game that started it all. Lots of the fundamental and even deeper aspects of the lore were established around this time, that were developed over the past 30 years into the sprawling and fantastic universe that we have today. That really should be given attention and respected, and not just hand-waved away as old stuff that's been retconned. And that will bring us to the end of this video. Will this knowledge ever be useful to both you or me? Probably not. But at the very least, I hope you learned something new about Arena, and maybe even had your appreciation raised for it a little bit. I think for the 30 years of adventure it's given us, it deserves at least that much.